Finding skilled recruits has been a pain point for manufacturers for years, caused by an underinvestment in education, inconsistent policy, an underinvestment in technology, and a deep underappreciation of manufacturing among parents and teachers. The pandemic and Brexit have now depleted our national workforce, and that risks turning this crisis into an existential threat for the sector. So what is being done, and what more could be done to meet this perfect storm? And a very warm welcome. I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by Johnny Williamson. Welcome, Johnny. And in Birmingham by Professor David Bailey. David, welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much for having me.
Johnny, we sometimes get accused of exaggerating, using the words crisis and so on. But I think when it comes to skills in manufacturing, I think we're on the money.
I think so, and there is a piece of research I came across recently that really brought this into light, and that's the fact that 20% of the UK manufacturing workforce are set to retire within 3 years. The average age is somewhere between 55 and 58, and 20% breaks down to around 500,000 people, the most experienced and skilled engineers, machine operators, managers, technicians leaving the industry. And that sounds unfathomable in 3 years, but really it's just one person retiring every 18 months from the UK's roughly 240,000 manufacturing businesses. Now, engineering and manufacturing apprentices and graduates works out about 80 to 100,000 a year. So even with those coming through and hopefully some people choosing not to retire early and staying on, we're still short tens of thousands of engineers a year.
That is a truly incredible thought. David, what are your initial thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely critical. I mean, we often talk in the UK about our productivity puzzle. I personally don't think it's much of a puzzle. We simply don't invest enough in skills, training, and in capital. And as a result of that, our long-term economic performance is poor. So getting training and skills right, especially in manufacturing, I think is fundamental.
I thought we'd get some more context on this from Hilary Levers, who's Chief Exec at Engineering UK.
The skills crisis is something that we have talked about for many years, and it is evolving skills crisis. So just because we've been talking about it for a long time, it doesn't mean that nothing's changing about it. So a lot of what is driving it at the moment is the need for new skills coming into the workforce around digitizations and handling big data and decarbonisation. And also employers are looking for more diversity in their workforce. So that's another new challenge that's coming in. Things have improved. So there are improvements in workforce diversity and in increased uptake along some engineering and tech workforce pathways. But I think it is a real risk. And when we talk to employers, we do hear that they are having to look elsewhere to meet their skills needs and actually move some of their production elsewhere.
And that, of course, is critical to the future of our manufacturing base in the UK. We asked Robert Harthorn, the Skills Minister, onto the show. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it. He did give us a statement, however. He said, boosting our nation's manufacturing skills is key to giving businesses the highly skilled employees they need to grow, which is why we're supporting people of all ages and backgrounds to upskill or retrain at any stage of their career. There's a range of government-backed skills training opportunities available from apprenticeships in mechatronics, welding and aerospace, to manufacturing courses available through our skills boot camps and free courses for job schemes. Our network of institutes of technology specialises in offering high-level STEM skills, including advanced manufacturing. T-levels in engineering and manufacturing are also on offer to help more young people gain the skills they need to climb the ladder of opportunity. David, I wonder what your thoughts are on what the Minister said. Does it sound much of a ladder to you?
No, it doesn't. And in fact, the government really focuses very heavily on academic qualifications and A-levels and pushing people into universities. And training and skills has always been for vocations, has always been the Cinderella of our education system. We simply don't take it seriously enough, unlike in Germany and other countries. And the minister reeled off a whole series of initiatives there, but they are piecemeal, unjoined up, over-centralised and underfunded. We need to do much more.
Of course, the new jewel in the crown of government education policy is the T-level programme, which we're going to be talking about with Hilary Levers in a moment. But first, I asked Hilary about apprenticeships. That is the core, and what David described as being absolutely critical to the future of manufacturing. This is what she had to say.
There has been a really significant decline in apprenticeships over the last decade or so, about 9%. Across engineering and tech and manufacturing, but actually as great as 34% in some areas. And I think it is actually engineering and manufacturing technologies is really been hit hard. There's a lot of things that have confounded delivery, and we find it quite hard to unpick the extent to which the levy has caused us challenges. And undoubtedly, we're still settling and working out how to use it, and there are amendments that have come through to improve it and open it up, make it more accessible for supply chain or SMEs if large employers aren't using it all and things like that. But the decline actually kind of started a bit before then, and the pandemic has obviously contributed as well. So it's quite hard to unpick what those challenges are in apprenticeships. And actually we're running an inquiry at the moment with Lord Knights and Lord Willits to really try and understand what has been driving that decline, and much more importantly, come up with some solutions for how we can improve things. And I'm optimistic that we will come up with some really clear recommendations and a deeper understanding of whether amendments to the levy might be the main driver of improvements, or if there's some more fundamental or just quite different things, actions that could be taken by government, but also by employers or trainers or sector supporters like us at Engineering UK.
I mentioned T-levels as being the latest jewel in the crown of government education policy. The last major initiative was the apprenticeship levy, designed to take money from companies with payrolls of over £3 million a year, create a fund from which SMEs in particular could run training courses and generally pay for their apprenticeship scheme. David, in Birmingham, what are your thoughts on the levy? As Hilary's just said, we haven't seen an increase in apprenticeships, we've seen a decline.
I think the idea behind the levy was good. What we've got here is, in a sense, a market failure. Companies hold back on training because they think if they invest in a worker, they may well go elsewhere. So everybody ends up holding back. So the fundamental goal was good. It's just it was very poorly executed. It was a very centralised fund. Firms really didn't have any say in how it was used, so they regarded it simply as a tax. And it wasn't devolved down to the level. So we had this ridiculous situation where we have mayors in many combined authorities, but don't control the fund and have a say with local business about how it's used. So I think it can be improved if we were to devolve it down to a more local level, where local government and mayors work with local businesses to decide how it's used. Then businesses would get more buy-in. The other problem is it didn't really help small firms. So it was really just about big firms, and it missed a big picture.
And of course, anecdotally, there were lots of stories of companies using what should have been an apprenticeship fund to fund things like MBAs for directors. And of course, that didn't help at all when it came to getting young people into work. Johnny, we're going to be hearing a lot more about companies training young people and taking their own initiatives. But listening to what David just said there about people holding back, I'm wondering if some of the difficulties that manufacturers face at the moment are down to really hard to shake habits on the part of some people.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that manufacturers face is the short-term strategy of going out and buying talent rather than necessarily training it internally. And that obviously has knock-on consequences long-term.
And that was something I heard from Stuart McKinley. He's skills director at the new Manufacturing Skills Academy at the National Manufacturing Institute of Scotland.
I think we have a culture in the UK of trying to recruit our way out of problems. So we have a challenge or we have a growth spurt and we look to recruit people. That has two downsides. One is that, what happens then is that the productivity goes with that person or those small group of people that move from company to company. And the improvements in productivity that we hope for in the UK are not realised because it's not passing through the whole organisation, because we're not traditionally investing enough in people and upskilling them and reskilling them. And the second point is that we're in a time of severe shortages in terms of the labour market. So you can't just go out anymore and recruit. There are still some employers doing it, and we're seeing a rate of pay awards above the UK norm on a rising scale, which means that ultimately that's not sustainable. So it's good for individuals, but not good for long term.
As we were saying about the apprenticeship levy, it's a good idea, doesn't produce the results or didn't produce the results that everybody hoped for. Stuart McKinley at Enmis in Scotland at the Skills Academy, he agrees actually that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Indeed, we don't all face the same problems across the UK.
I think we've seen very different problems, as you mentioned, the consequences of policies, and they're not always unintended. They're not always intended, of course, or else they wouldn't do it in the first place. But clearly, in England, what we've seen is a drop-off in the number of apprenticeships, and that really does need to be sorted out, particularly in a time of severe labour market shortages. We've almost got the opposite problem in Scotland, where this year we'll have the highest ever number recorded of engineering modern apprenticeship starts. But actually, the Scottish Government has had to cap the number of apprenticeships this year. So we need more, but there's no more funding for it. Just at the time when the economy, certainly in Scotland, I know better the Scottish economy, of course, but the sector in Scotland is really buoyant. We've seen Scottish engineering report 8 consecutive quarters of growth for the first time in something like 30 years. And that's before things like ScotWind start to wash through the system.
David, I thought that was really interesting to hear what Stuart said. There's such a demand for apprenticeships that they've had to cap the number, while in England it's almost impossible to fulfil the numbers. What's going on there?
Yeah, it was a really interesting example, wasn't it? It comes back to the point I've been making about the need to really devolve skills policy down to a local level. And in Scotland, they have the institutional setup to do that. They've simply run out of money. So more funding needed in that case. In other parts of the UK, particularly in England, we need to put those devolution structures in place to be able to do things more locally and then back it up with funding. And remember, we've got these big challenges that we often talk about: net zero, industry 4.0. We've got an ageing workforce, and we need to think locally, very creatively about how we deal with these big challenges. Training is part of that.
Well, for those of you who may not be familiar with Enmis, the National Manufacturing Institute Scotland, it is part of the High Value Manufacturing Catapult, and it does seem to be doing a really good job. It's very clear, Johnny, though, that everybody involved in this issue, right the way from institutions like the HVMC, manufacturers, government, everybody needs to up their game if we're going to grasp a solution to this issue.
Absolutely. As David just said, the challenges of net zero, sustainable manufacturing, Industry 4.0, exporting more to the rest of the world. These are challenges, but they also hold great opportunity if only we can get the people element right.
Well, let's hear from a manufacturer who is absolutely on top of this and has got some ideas of his own. Tony Haig, who's the CEO of PP Control and Automation.
I think the UK right now is at a pivotal point in all that's followed over the last 2 or 3 years. I think there's a real opportunity for some serious investment and some serious growth in UK manufacturing, but we're going to be hamstrung in order to seize that growth if we haven't got the right people. We can put in short-term tactical solutions, we can look at all sorts of things, but UK manufacturers need a strong pipeline, a strong conveyor belt of technically trained and competent people. And further education has a big part to play in that, but not just further education. Manufacturers shouldn't look always at government or somebody else to solve their problems for them. They have a part to play, but manufacturers themselves can do more. They can invest. They can look at developing training academies, training schools. You don't have to be a big organisation to start investing in your people.
And of course, that is happening. Manufacturers large and small have given up waiting for the problems with the apprenticeship levy and FE courses to work themselves out.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting that Rowan Crozier, who's CEO of Brandauer, also in the West Midlands, in the same area as Tony Haig and PP Control and Automation, like many companies, they've taken the issue and run with it, setting up their own skills academy.
So Brandauer have been making precision progression press tools for a little over 160 years now. And with that comes a need for a very high level of skilled engineer, toolmaker specifically, to enable us to do that. In the last 3 years, the demand for our tooling has increased dramatically. So 2 things we needed: more skilled engineers and more capacity equipment to make tools. So we partnered with our training provider, Incom Training, over in Aldridge, to do 2 things: gain access to some of their spare capacity and space for us to lay down a second tool room, but also for us to jointly write and develop a syllabus to upskill existing engineers to be skilled Brandauer toolmakers. And the final piece of that puzzle really was to deliver that tool room and begin delivering training, not only for us, but for all of local manufacturing industry. And here we are today. We're a year into that, and the first course is going live this week. They'll be trained in the classroom by Incom employees, and then practically they'll be working alongside my current tooling engineers and machinists to hone that skill to become toolmakers over a 20-week period. The syllabus itself is something that we have based on our own learning and development process for new tooling, and we've broken down that process really into bite-sized learning chunks. We've also gone out to industry nationally, and we're already getting interest as far north as Sheffield and as far south as Brighton, where we've got people that are bought into that syllabus and structure to deliver what is a big gap, as I've already mentioned, in the marketplace. I also sit on the advisory board for Make UK, which is a national membership organisation, and my plan is to, once we've proven the content on our first 2 or 3 cohorts over the next 18 months or so, we certainly have big plans to potentially push that out, certainly further afield regionally and potentially further afield nationally in the UK.
I think maybe Brandauer and Incom Training are onto something. Possibly the traditional learning model of multi-year courses, real deep dives into a subject, just isn't appropriate for the age we live in. That's a point that Stuart McKinley at the Manufacturing Skills Academy has really looked into.
We all know that there's a real labour market shortage and a skills crisis. We know that manufacturers have less people, less staff than they used to have, so there's less spare capacity to do training. And we know that the rate of change is increasingly faster and faster, so needing to acquire new knowledge is happening at an increased rate. So the only way you can do all of those things, or one of the key ways of doing that, is to make smaller bite-sized chunks of learning. And so we've developed a suite of micro-credentials, which not in itself new, but actually bundled them together in a way that is recognised or valued by employers. So we have a 20-credit module that has a 10-credit core, and then a series of 2-credit modules from different universities and institutes that employers can choose to reflect what they require and not what perhaps a provider is giving off the shelf. Our role is to help attract talent into the manufacturing sector and to identify and provide talent and skills and support where it doesn't currently exist. So for us, that often involved in shaping policy and making sure that working with partners that the right courses are available. So for example, we work with SDS to launch the Digital Manufacturing Foundation Apprenticeship, which children can take while they're still at school as an alternative to, certainly in Scotland, Scottish level qualifications. But equally, we worked with them to develop the higher level technical apprenticeship in digital manufacturing, making sure that they were putting in the right content that employers require for that. So we will have not so much students coming through the course. Of course, we will have some, but predominantly it will be employees and individuals who are looking for work.
David, as an academic, how much are you seeing learning styles change in response not only to what businesses demand, but also to the needs of students and employees?
Well, let's not forget, we've not long ago been through a pandemic where essentially we had to very quickly switch to online provision, and we're never going to go back to how we were with students only sitting in a classroom these days increasingly is blended so that people can access it in different ways. We're also seeing, lots of universities doing different things. That could be bespoke programs for companies, manufacturing firms. It could be degree apprenticeships. It could be executive modular type programs. So we have to be much more creative and flexible about how we educate the future workforce, particularly given all of the challenges that Johnny was just talking about. Universities have got to adapt if we're really going to be relevant in the world going forwards.
Johnny, none of this is helped by the fact that a lot of colleges are finding it very difficult to recruit teachers.
Absolutely, yeah. Engineering is the hardest subject to recruit for, according to head teachers. I suppose the other issue is that we have this dislocation of where lots of people are in the urban centres and where manufacturing takes place, typically in a much more rural setting. So the same goes for learning centres, I suppose. There's this postcode lottery, which is something that NMIS really get.
I think that leads you to a model whereby you have as we do, a hub effectively, but we have the spokes as well. And some of those spokes will be delivering content on a more local basis. Some of it will be delivering content on a more sectoral basis. And some of it will be about actually looking at online content, and some of it will be blended. So it's actually working out, what does the sector need? And then how do we best shape that? So, for example, we worked with the photonics sector. That's, it's worth over £1 billion a year in Scotland. And they couldn't find a practical-based course that had theory that met the need of people that were going to work with the laser sector. So we actually got the employers, we worked with them, and we've got them to create the course, to identify how long it was, how much of it was practical, how much of it was theoretical, to design the end test, and then actually commit to interviews for people who passed the test at the end.
David, I know that you're acutely conscious and deeply interested in this whole issue of place-based learning and regional policy. It's obvious that there is some kind of postcode lottery going on, really as a legacy of history about where manufacturing's located. The fact is that an awful lot of people are not where manufacturers need them to be.
Yes, that's right. And we've seen, of course, the economy change over time, and in many cases, people be deeply rooted in their societies and sort of less mobile. So I think we have to embrace technology and be able to teach and educate in different ways. Coming back to Johnny's earlier point as well about the really important role of colleges. Remember as well, we kind of destroyed the polytechnic system and made them become universities. In so doing, many of them lost their links with business and manufacturing. We need to bring that back. And we need to really properly value FE, further education. It's been woefully underfunded and discarded over the years. So it's not just universities. We need a variety of different actors to engage with business and manufacturing in different ways and increasingly join it up so that we collaborate across different spaces.
Yes, it's clear that working out some kind of solution to this regional issue and this postcode lottery is going to have to come about. But what I find interesting about the work that NMIS are doing is that they're looking beyond styles of learning. They're also looking at bottlenecks that are taking place in the apprenticeship system in particular.
We're in here to be transformative. So that means being at the cutting edge. Of course, that doesn't mean we're going to get everything right. We're going to make mistakes. But by listening to employers and listening to their demands and their needs, we'll get more right than we get wrong. And again, just give you another example, we know employers across the whole of the UK are suffering from some severe labour market shortages. So it's not just about looking at what the skills challenges are and trying to identify them and solve them, but it's actually looking at the whole system and saying, where in the system can we actually do things more effectively? So we're actually undertaking a piece of work this month. We're asking employers to look at what is in effect an apprentice and graduate clearinghouse idea, because we know that certainly large employers will interview, sometimes many hundreds of people for apprenticeship roles. I can tell you there's a large employer in Scotland who've interviewed 600 people for about 200 apprenticeships. Now, there'll be a large number of those that are really good candidates that they just don't make that top 100. But often what will happen is they will just bleed out of the system. They don't go into the SMEs, they don't go into the supply chain, and they probably end up working for Asda or Costco and effectively bed blocking for roles for people that might be better suited to those kind of roles. So how do we identify those individuals, capture them in a way that means we can then, the ones that are good, feed into the supply chain, and the ones that don't quite meet the standard, well, you know what? They've actually expressed an interest in manufacturing. So how do we capture them, harness that interest and that energy, and feed them into the appropriate part of the system, whether it's a college or whether it's a university or whether it's another employer?
I think that's a really interesting initiative because it's very clear that the OEMs are the bright lights that attract all the most ambitious and the most talented of young people. What happens to those, as Stuart was saying, it's not always clear.
I think there's a really positive example from the automotive supply chain. I believe it was Jaguar Land Rover. They advertised for apprenticeships. They needed a few dozen. They had hundreds apply. They vetted all of them, took the ones they wanted. But all of those that didn't make it to Jaguar Land Rover, they showed an interest in engineering and manufacturing apprenticeships. And Jaguar Land Rover then helped place them within their supply chain. And I think that's a real positive example of someone at the top helping lift those beneath them.
And of course, I suppose what really matters is whether that somehow translates into a kind of formalised process. So that will happen across the piece. It would obviously be fantastic if it could, but as always, who's going to fund it? Let's continue talking government policy on education because we touched on apprenticeships, we've dealt with that. Now let's look at T-levels. There's a lot of criticism that's been attached to them.
Yeah, and I think part of it is that not enough people know about them. The government has newly introduced them. The T-levels are 2-year post-GCSE qualifications, an alternative to A-levels, much more vocational focused, and they're intended really to bridge that gap between what's taught in classrooms and what's the reality of a live working environment. And part of that is a minimum 45 days industry placement. That's much, much longer than the traditional 1 or 2 week work placement. But then obviously it does require businesses to take students for a minimum of 45 days a year. So the T-levels are being phased in over 3 or 4 years. The manufacturing and engineering focused ones were introduced last September and already Make UK's raised concerns about the number of placements that need to be offered. I think they've said something like 43,000 need to be placed, and yet less than 10% of eligible businesses are actually hosting these placements.
Well, it's obvious that there are significant issues and significant hurdles to jump when it comes to the T-levels, but it is early days. Policy has yet to bed in, and Hilary Levers believes it's not all doom and gloom.
We can't really know for sure how they're going to land until they are up and running at scale. But in terms of having a very rich and highly regarded technical route that runs alongside A-levels and has been very much employer-led in terms of the content development, I think they present a great opportunity. And the provision of that work placement to help young people really get on-the-job learning and insight as to what a career in a particular area would look like, I think is great. And those connections between employers and young people that we're seeing just in the earliest adopters look really positive. And actually, there are lots of young people who stay on with the employers who provided those work placements. I think we really need a concerted comms campaign to make sure that all employers really understand what T-levels are, and they don't at the moment. So understanding what the provision is, and then looking at what it would take to motivate them to offer those placements. And we know it's quite hard for employers at the moment in terms of they feel very pressured by the immediate workforce needs, and it may be that they've got a limited resource in this area for engaging young people, and actually they need to invest in building the future workforce. If the employers who may then retain some of the people on T-level placements into apprenticeships and into, or even directly into employment, then that's fine. And I think it's very easy for them to see why they would make that commitment. But if they would be doing it more as a greater good effort and not recruiting until a bit later down the line when those young people have had additional training, I would just really encourage them to take that long-term view. They need it. They will need it for themselves. They will need it for their supply chain. They will need it for their sector. No employer can be successful on their own. So it is about making that investment and putting that effort into something which will be a really transformational experience for young people.
And that really does reinforce the point, David, doesn't it? I mean, manufacturers demand a lot of action from government, but manufacturers themselves need to step up to the plate.
Yes, they do. I mean, I do think T levels are very exciting, particularly if we finally put a value on vocational training and education, which is as good as A level. That could be a real profound change. But I think Johnny made a really useful point earlier in that some of the big companies often get massive applications for their apprenticeship programs. And there was that interesting case of Jaguar Land Rover where they then kind of vetted them all and helped place them in their supply chain. Well, perhaps we could push that further in the context of T levels. What we used to do in this country was overtrain, in the sense that the nationalised industries and the big companies trained way more apprenticeships than they needed, and the ones they didn't need at the end of the programme were then released into the supply chain. Why can't we do something like that with T levels, where we say to the likes of Rolls-Royce, Jaguar Land Rover, JCB, the really big players, look, we will fund you to take way more placements than you really need to get people through this educational program, so that those students can then go into the supply chain. And often the supply chain doesn't have the time or the resources to do that, but it would be a way of government helping the big players help the supply chain go forwards.
So yeah, how do manufacturers actually spare the time and money and staff to take on all these initiatives? Because it really is very, very labour intensive, time and money intensive, but it can pay off. There's MCNC, which is a specialist aerospace company down in Bridgewater in Somerset, decided to set up the Festival of British Engineering and Manufacturing. And they got advice from Angela Lawler, a former production line manager at Jaguar Land Rover, who has set up Marvellous Manufacturing. Now, the idea behind her company is to help people set up festivals if they want, or she will go into schools and talk to school children about local manufacturers in their area. Angela says that what happened down in Bridgewater was absolutely stunning, and the investment paid off.
We went down to MCNC for their manufacturing festival. And obviously Lee Howarth, he's a great advocate for engaging with schools. So he just loved when I originally talked to him about it, he just loved the idea. He always knew he wanted to do something, but wasn't quite sure what to do. And we went down there. There were over 200 students attended over the 2 days. Lee had some of their suppliers, some of their customers, and the students were able to walk around, see what was being made, touch and feel some of the items, talk to the suppliers, even things like, some of the suppliers set up desks with some of the tooling on, and just the students just loved being able to pick them up and touch them and talk to the suppliers about what their uses were. Overall, it was an incredibly successful 2 days.
David, it's obvious this style of outreach, this kind of thing that Lee Howarth set up was absolutely brilliant, the FOBEM. Young people love to see and touch things rather than simply being told about them.
Absolutely. If people can experience what modern manufacturing is about, it can inspire them. And we need to do that as early as possible in their lives, when they're at school, when they're at college or university, so that they can really see how exciting this can be. And that was a wonderful example, I thought, of how to get kids engaged at a very early age.
Yes, that's really, really important. And I think that people who organise things like careers fairs need to understand that you can't just tell young people about what's great in the world of manufacturing or anything else in the economy. You have to actually show them. And Angela Lawler has anecdotal evidence of this herself.
I had a conversation with a careers leader this morning, and she said that she took a group of students to the skills show in Birmingham, and the students came away and they were just not inspired at all. She took another group to a construction company down the road for an afternoon out, and they came back buzzing. And that is the difference, because they can actually go and see these places. They can go and see manufacturing premises and see all of the amazing things that are going on, and realise that this perception that manufacturing is a dirty place to work, it is wrong. They get so much out of it, and particularly when I was down in Bridgewater for FOBEM, the buzz around the factory was just unbelievable. The students thoroughly enjoyed it, and I think Lee has said himself before now, that since doing that festival, he hasn't had to advertise an apprenticeship vacancy. He's actually had students coming to him and asking if they can do an apprenticeship. So yes, it means taking a day out. Yes, it means opening up your doors for a day and doing some organising. But the benefits are amazing. Even now, with all those initiatives, I go into schools and I ask the students, do you know about manufacturing? And so many of them say, I've never heard of it, or I don't know anything about it. And one of the things I wanted to do, because a lot of manufacturers say to me, we don't have time to engage. And I can understand that, because a lot of them are SMEs, they're family businesses, they're probably doing several jobs within that business. So I can understand that they don't have time to engage. And this is why I said, okay, I'll go and engage on your behalf. So although there are a lot of initiatives that go into schools and they talk about manufacturing and engineering, I actually go in and I talk about specific manufacturers in that school's area. If I ask the students in that school, can you name me your local shops? They'll say, yep, there's Fred's Fish Shop, there's a Nisa supermarket. But if I ask them, can you name me your local manufacturers? They can't do it. And this is why I feel it's so important to go in and talk about specific manufacturers to the students.
And if you have the desire to set up your own festival of manufacturing, Angela has created a package that will help you emulate what Lee Howarth did with MC&C and their Festival of British Engineering and Manufacturing in Bridgewater. The fact that he's never had to advertise for an apprentice since then should give you an indication of how vital this kind of initiative can be. And of course, you can involve everybody in your supply chain as well. It really is a remarkable thing. Johnny, the connections that are being made at this very early age with young people by manufacturers with initiatives like this, absolutely vital.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. But equally vital is the chronic imperative for UK manufacturing to invest in modern technology and equipment, and not only to become more competitive, but in terms of this skills issue we're talking about, to become more attractive to young recruits. And we were talking earlier around these hard to break habits. One of those habits is our reliance on manual labour. We have a preference to avoid investing in new technologies and equipment.
Well, that's a drum that Mike Wilson, who's the Chief Automation Officer at MTC, has been banging for many a year.
But I think fundamentally we have a cultural issue. We like to keep our old machinery running, and therefore we don't tend to invest in new equipment, and the uptake of robots has suffered as a consequence of that as well. It's affecting us in a couple of ways. Our politicians typically don't like to talk about robots and automation because of that fear that the population is going to see that as a threat to their employment. And I think also, particularly within the SMEs, there are concerns about maintaining employment. People employ people and they want to continue to give them jobs. But I think, unfortunately, those misconceptions lead to bigger problems. And if our industries or our manufacturers do not ensure that they are competitive, then ultimately they're going to decline, and therefore we will lose more jobs. And I think all the evidence demonstrates that those companies that have invested in robots and automation have become more competitive and have grown, and they've employed more people. And probably what's more important, the jobs that they are employing the people for are actually better paid jobs, because they're using the skills of the people more effectively rather than doing the mundane, the dirty, the dangerous jobs that typically robots are being used to undertake. And therefore, the only approach really is to look at increasing the use of robots and automation. And we are seeing greater uptake throughout UK manufacturing, but it's still early stages. And I always have the fear that we'll kind of resort to type and we'll solve the problem another way rather than investing in the latest equipment. The technology's moved on an awful lot over the last 5 or 10 years, and therefore actually using and applying automation is much easier than it used to be. But we also, probably the bigger challenge is we need skills for the people to identify the right kind of applications, to design the solutions so that they can be installed appropriately within manufacturing sites. And those skills are much harder to learn. They require quite some good experience, and it's important that we try and help manufacturing businesses by developing the supply chain, developing the systems integrators that build these solutions so that they can deliver what manufacturing needs. So yes, I agree, there are challenges there, but I think they're addressable challenges.
David, I think that's a really significant point, that we may be recruiting today for technology that will be outdated tomorrow. That is a real headache.
Yes, it is. I mean, let's remember technological change always happens. So the technologies will be constantly changing, and therefore the skills and training required is going to have to change throughout people's lives. So I think this challenge isn't just about getting more people into manufacturing, but how we improve their skills throughout their working careers. And I've often gone on about this in terms of how other countries do that better than here in the UK, particularly in Singapore, where they have a skills future program constantly targeting the key skills that are required in the future. So it's certainly the case, I think, that we're often training people for technology that very quickly becomes obsolete. But we also have to remember that starts right at school. So it's said, for example, that 2/3 of the jobs that kids in primary schools will go into simply don't exist yet. So in a world that is constantly changing, we have to think about educating and re-educating throughout people's lives. We can't guarantee people jobs in the future because the industry, the economy will be fundamentally different, but we can equip them with the skills to learn new skills in the future.
Tony Haig at PP Control and Automation also believes that after the seismic shocks that have happened, taken place in the supply chains, pandemic, Ukraine and so on, manufacturers should really look at their business models to make the most of the opportunities they've got, the most of the skills they've got and the skills they can recruit.
If you've exhausted all normal routes to finding and retaining talent, and that lack of talent is holding back your ability to scale and grow and seize the market opportunities. I think one thing that we can be more aware of is, I guess, the power of collaboration and looking at non-core activities, what's core to your business, finding partners that are, I guess, specialists and have expertise that you don't necessarily have. So a form of outsourcing, but outsourcing that is strategic by nature, not just tactical, not just as a response to a short-term need, but I guess doing what we see companies in Japan do well, companies in Germany do well, companies in America do better than us. Just that collaboration within geographic areas, within vertical sectors, just finding friends and partners to work with that may be able to fill those gaps for you to allow you to concentrate on what you do best. When I joined the company, over the last 2 decades I've been at PP, there are many things that we used to do internally that we now outsource ourselves to partners. So the things that we used to do that we would have classified a number of years ago that were a core part of our activity, when you actually get down into the weeds, they're not core at all. The processes that add little value to ourselves or our customers, we can outsource them. And we can be more responsive and more agile and give our customers a better service by outsourcing those services and solutions ourselves.
Tony Haig demonstrating, just like Rowan Crozier at Brandauer, that the DIY route is something that a lot of manufacturers are doing, but many more will need to do.
We spoke right at the beginning of this programme about the huge amount of people that are going to leave the industry in 3 years. And the reality is that companies need these people, need these skills faster than they're going to come out of the classroom. So yes, they need to take that long-term development of their skills pipeline, but also they need to be developing their own internal workforce as well, upskilling them, retraining them, creating future opportunities for them.
And of course, Tony Haig is absolutely 100% behind that.
I think the old adage, you have to grow your own. You've got to invest in your own talent. You've got to invest in your people. It's very easy to get, CapEx sign off, relatively speaking. It's people that, are the lifeblood of any business. Having our own internal training school allows us to see people grow, see people develop, promote from within wherever possible. We've got, a strong apprenticeship system as well that's working really well. I mean, particularly in areas of more specialist skills and engineering and technical capabilities, companies really do have to, bite the bullet and invest and train. And I remember the old saying that somebody once asked me, well, what if you train people and they leave? And we said, well, what if you don't train them and they stop? So, it's really key to bring people through your organisation. And you know what? We do lose a few people that we train, and good luck to them. And equally, we'll no doubt take advantage of other companies that are training their people. You have to see it as, a part of a long-term strategy.
I don't think it's a coincidence that both PP Control and Automation and Brandauer, founder members of the Midlands Assembly Network, collaboration and partnerships are absolutely in their DNA. David, we've heard this word collaboration a lot during the course of the programme. It's increasingly apparent that it's not a nice to have, but it's a must have in UK manufacturing. The entire sector is going to have to rethink the way it works together in order to assure some kind of future.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I think we have, because of the short-termist pressures on manufacturing, because of the way the financial system works, a very defensive style of capitalism. And yet we know that firms that collaborate do better in terms of things like innovation, but also we see it in training. And that was a great example of essentially manufacturers doing it for themselves. We see as well Make UK running a great apprenticeship system in the Midlands where it benefits lots of small firms. I'm just back from Bologna, where I've been in a place called Packaging Valley, where there's this big manufacturing packaging industry, which has been supported over many years through training programs offered by the regional government for that particular cluster. And in academia, we often talk about what's called a triple helix, which is business, government and institutions, colleges, universities working together. I think we're going to have to see that when it comes to training going forwards. One big issue, I think, on the horizon is that the government, having once abolished regional development agencies and created local enterprise partnerships, now, at the last budget, seems to be winding those down. And responsibility in this area seems to be going back to local authorities. Sadly, they're massively overloaded and underfunded. So it's an issue of which part of government is going to engage with businesses and universities in offering this sort of training going forward.
One of the things I was discussing with Angela Lawler in our conversation was the fact there are so many entities out there in the world of STEM and schools outreach, wondering whether perhaps there are so many voices, so many initiatives, and not enough oomph, not enough power, because so much of it is dissipated. She agreed and thought that a unified approach might work better. Well, Hilary Levers at Engineering UK has come up with a plan.
We're trying to get that 1 + 1 makes 3. And we actually run the Tomorrow's Engineers Code that came out of the Year of Engineering in 2018, where organisations came together and coordinated and collaborated in their work with schools and young people. And they really felt that that was so valuable that they created the code that we now run on behalf of the community. And we have about 250 signatures, and they are government departments, or it could be organisations who do the delivery of STEM engagement, but also many, many employers across the spectrum of engineering and technology and manufacturing. And I really encourage any employer who is listening to take a look. It's free to join, and it's a place where you can sign up and really be supported to work with others, to better coordinate or share resources around inclusion, or pick up PowerPoints about how to talk about careers to 11 to 14-year-olds, all sorts of really practical advice, lots of webinars and some in-person events as well. And we want to double the number of employers we're working with. So please do take a look.
I think that's a fantastic initiative that Engineering UK have got going there. But, one of the biggest nuts to crack, Johnny, as always, is the fact that not enough is known in the wider culture of the UK about the career opportunities presented by manufacturing.
I know, and obviously there's a lot of focus on young people, but two other huge influences on the choices those young people make are parents and teachers. So we really need to ensure that those influences, those groups also understand the huge array of opportunities a career in manufacturing and engineering provides. So let's have some final thoughts from our contributors on the issue.
I think there is a real challenge to how young people and their influences, their parents and their teachers, perceive engineering and jobs in engineering and technology and the sorts of people who might move into those jobs. There's an underestimation, a misunderstanding about what those contemporary roles look like, a misunderstanding about who they are appropriate for, and also just some basic misunderstandings, for example, about the salary levels that can be gained and what it is to be an engineer, that creative and problem solving and societally relevant piece of engineering, which maybe just isn't embedded in people who would just think of really kind of old school, large machinery. So I think there is a big shift in culture in terms of who might do those roles and in understanding that is needed. We're bringing together organisations to try and share best practice and better coordinate that messaging and the outreach that happens with young people. So we build a community, the Tomorrow's Engineers Code. Anyone can join it. It's free to join if you care about this, and please do look it up. And if you are reaching out to young people, there are all sorts of tools that we can support you with to make sure that the careers messaging is accurate and appropriate and inclusive. So I think that actually all of that stuff we can do better, and we're now in progress of improving all of that outreach. But also things are improving. So, for example, a big shift that we've been wanting to see is an improvement in the gender in the engineering workforce. And that has actually gone up just 6 percentage points, but it's gone up from 10% to 16.5% since 2010. And that was a shift that lots of people and lots of organisations were trying to see. And so that is starting to happen. It isn't like we're not making progress, but the demand continues to grow. And, you know, obviously people are retiring out of the workforce, and we have some really large areas of workforce growth, particularly, as I said, in decarbonisation and areas like that.
I think pre-pandemic, we were on a really positive trend with the current policies around apprenticeships. And I think that's something that must continue. Sadly, the pandemic did affect the number of young people moving on to apprenticeships. That's regardless of whether it's engineering or not. I'm biased towards engineering and manufacturing, obviously. So there needs to be a big push to keep that influx of young people seeing manufacturing and engineering as a real life positive career. So long as that happens, we will see a recovery. But again, it's about promoting it to not only the learners, but the learners' parents and family, that it's a great environment to work in and a really good career choice.
To increase the number of engineers coming through, we need to find ways of making it interesting and attractive for the school children of today, and make sure that we can then look after them as they come through the education process to retain their interest in engineering all the way through, so that they come out the other end as people that want to be engineers working for manufacturing. I think that's the biggest challenge, and there are ways of doing that. But it needs a conscious decision across the UK, from the politicians to the education system to manufacturers as well, to ensure that we collectively work together to address that problem. Firstly, we want to start with the schools, because we've got to get the children interested in an early age. And I do think robotics is a great way of doing it. Obviously, I'm a little bit biased, but robotics are interesting. They're exciting for children. It does get them motivated. And there are schools robot competitions. So there's an organisation called Vex Robotics that runs schools robot competitions on a global basis. And in this country, there are a few hundred schools that regularly participate every year in regional and national UK championships. And the winning teams can go to the global championships wherever they may be held. And I would love to expand that. I think we want to get more of the automation supply chain, the integrators, the robot vendors and so on, supporting their local schools to help them develop teams that can then compete in these kind of competitions. But we also want the education system to recognise that as being important as well. And if we can get the children interested, and I should say that a few years ago, I was working at a company called ABB Robotics, and we were sponsoring a team of a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old, both girls, who competed in the UK National Championships, were successful, and then went to Chicago to compete in the Global Championships. So it just demonstrates it is possible. And if we can get more of the children interested and excited at primary school age, we then have to continue that through to secondary schools. And again, the robot competitions can help address that. But then most importantly, we need to make sure that they have a route to take that forward. And I think that's where we need to particularly help support the further education colleges. They need the equipment. They need modern equipment, which doesn't have to be expensive, but they need modern equipment, robotics, for example, that again will draw the children into the courses. And we also need to equip the teaching staff with the skills to make the most of that equipment, and also to demonstrate what the potential is in these kind of technology areas. And I should add, robotics is a great tool in that it encompasses many different engineering disciplines, from mechanics, electronics and electrical through to software, programming, AI and so on. So it gives you the opportunity within one tool to actually demonstrate all forms of engineering. And I think if we can do that from schools through to further education and also the work that's currently being done in the universities, I think we stand a much greater chance of producing a whole series of engineers coming out of our education system. And most importantly, not just boys, because the girls are equally interested in these kind of technologies. And if we can keep them interested all the way through the education system, we hopefully will start to address the balance of gender in terms of having male and female engineers in the workforce as well.
One of the things for me is that we tend to have in this country a knee-jerk reaction. We only deal with the situation when it hits us in the face. What we should be doing is we should be talking to students in year 7, in year 8. They're great. When I go to careers fairs, they're so enthusiastic. They ask lots of questions. They want to know all about it. And we should be feeding this information into them. And yes, okay, they're not going to be our employees for another 5 or 6 years, but by building that engagement with them, by letting them know we're there and what we do, and then keeping in contact with the schools as they progress through the years, through their GCSEs, through their A-levels, being in their mind's eye all the time, then we are lining up our future pipeline.
Some very positive final thoughts from Angela Lawler there. David, we've come to the end of the programme. What struck you most about what you've heard during the course of all this?
Well, as always with manufacturing TV, I think what I've learned most is about the passion, the commitment and the creativity of manufacturing in the UK to get on with the job. So they're clearly doing it. Universities, colleges are willing to engage in lots of different ways. And I think the onus is very much on the government to step up to the plate and really make this work.
Johnny, you and I have been covering this story for donkey's years, mostly with a despairing tone. Have you heard anything today that makes you feel like there are some positive answers and solutions out there?
Absolutely, and these are solutions that are already being championed and put in place by companies, either manufacturers or on the supporting side. What we really need is to take these pockets of excellence and put some policy behind it, so that rather than a fragmented, disjointed landscape, it's a lot more connected, and the rising tide lifts all ships.
We call this programme The Perfect Storm, and I hope we've demonstrated that even among the darkest clouds, there are some very bright silver linings. But I hope we've also demonstrated that this is a truly urgent issue. Doing nothing is not an option. There has to be much greater collaboration among manufacturers, and there has to be much more joined up thinking and understanding among policymakers about what needs to be done to create a brighter future for manufacturing in the UK.